Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever you happenstance into this Truth Bomb riff. I am so fortunate and honored to be joined by Zev Shalev, and we are recording this on Monday, September 15th, 2025 at approximately 5 p.m., 6 p.m. Eastern, getting close to that time, actually. 5 p.m. Eastern, sorry. And Zev, it is really extraordinary to make your acquaintance and have the opportunity to dialogue with you in light of all of that's going on. I've recently discovered you, and when I delved in to your Substack account, which is called, and I'm going to have to go here to look at it, Narrative,
Narrative.org.
yeah, the narrative.org with Zev Shalev. And your subtext is where the truth lives, and you're also, I'm sure, available, and we'll discuss it downstream with all of some of your other social media platforms. But you are, and it says here actually on your Substack page, that you do daily dispatches from the front lines of the war on democracy from ex CBS News EP, from an ex CBS News EP. And I love this quote. It says, rarely wrong, often ahead, and effective in ways history may yet fully credit. And I love that because on your narrative page, I just happened to catch you on another podcast and I started to emulate because I had actually had an opportunity to engage with Lev Parnas recently, and I discovered you through Lev Parnas, and suddenly I was drawn to this work that you've done called The Greatest Heist, and I'll just leave that there and bring it back full circle to our conversation because there is a lot going on, my friend. What's at the top of your sort of mind at the moment?
I'm excited to talk to you, Patrick. I've also recently discovered you, and I think that there's a lot of overlapping territory, and I think your work is extraordinary in terms of trying to ferret out some of the corruption that's been going on in our economic system for the last, God knows how long, but definitely over the last 20, 30 years.
Too
Uh,
long. And
too
you're
long is
absolutely
right.
right.
Yeah, and I'm also excited about the Clean New Deal, which sounds like a really promising endeavor that you're trying to pursue. So I think there's a lot of good fertile ground for us to be talking about and cooperating with. So it's terrific to meet you and good to be on your podcast. What's on the top of my mind today? I mean, there's a lot of Charlie Kirk is on the top of my mind today because it's hard not to feel like we're being. Don't you feel sometimes like we're living in a simulation that the world is happening around us like it's theater, and even though the harsh reality is that people are dying, of course, it's still theater. And yeah, I look at this, the way they're exploiting the narratives, the way they're putting out narratives after, which are designed to target different groups and designed to target, first left-leaning people, then it's like designed to target trans people, and who knows where they're going to go next. It seems so artificial, the world we're living in some ways. And the institutions we used to rely on, the authorities that we used to believe in, are just not trustworthy anymore. They just don't give us what we think is the truth. What I think we're getting is narrative production, is force feeding narratives like they do in Russia or in other parts of the world.
Well, and that's exactly right. And that's why I was so blown away because I have been trying to ferret through this madness for now over a decade, quite frankly. I'm in my 13th year on this journey that reveals the work that we've put together in our platform called The Con that people can find at thecon.tv. But the nature and the magnitude of our efforts was such that, and it's so cool that you were an executive producer at CBS because it was really the failure of mainstream media that led me on my journey. Now, I've been in the business a long time as a producer. I've worked at different levels, particularly as it relates to studio type projects and fictional depictions and so forth. But my interest was always, quite frankly, truth or narrative truth by way of documentary and how people put together very important subjects for our consideration to give us deep dives that we can't see otherwise. And as I started to discover you and then discover the work that you've done, I was absolutely blown away because it was clear to me that you recognize, as I have, that the platforms of mainstream media had been corrupted for far too long, which led you on a journey. And you came out of mainstream media. Can you give me some perspective in terms of where you come from and kind of who you are from that vantage?
I've been a journalist since I was 18 in South Africa, where my first job was at a radio station called Radio 702, where I was at a very young age made the assistant news editor. It was the only independent radio station in apartheid South Africa. So it was the only place where you can get the truth in apartheid South Africa. Everything else was state controlled. And it found its way into the existence because it was officially broadcasting from a independent homeland that the apartheid government had set up within South Africa, and therefore was able to skirt all these state regulations. So this one entrepreneur came up with this idea of like, well, we'll broadcast from Bophuthatswana into Johannesburg and Pretoria, the main cities in the sort of the biggest province, most prominent province of South Africa. And I loved this radio station. I got a job right out of high school there, while still going to university, and this was right as apartheid was ending. You know, it was my initiation into journalism was the end of apartheid, which was titanic clash between right and wrong and race and a whole bunch of other things, and in a most extraordinary resolution in South Africa turned out to be fairly peaceful and fairly clean. I mean, it turns out to be a assessment of corruption now, but certainly at that time, it was quite a historic moment when, Nelson Mandela came out of prison and was elected president. So that's my background. Since then, I've worked in television in Canada, which I loved, still love Canada because I still live here. And then I moved to the States about 15 years ago to exec produce the CBS Morning News after a string of successes here in Canada. That was it was something else to be part of that network environment and I love morning television, and I think that that 7 a.m. to 9 a.m. Time slot on the network television is by far the most influential of any time slots on television, because those network shows, regardless of their shrinking size now, still hold the majority of the audience. And so you can really determine the day's agenda for people. What the choices you make in terms of news on any given day, whether it's ABC's Today Show, so Good Morning America, or to NBC's Today Show. Sorry about that. They give you a lot of flexibility to determine the agenda of the news. So this was during Obama's presidency and as he became president. So I got to cover that part. And then at the end of it all, there's many reasons why I never stayed at CBS, but we can go into that another time. I ended up doing some work for Oprah, and I did some work on the Fuse News, on the Fuse Network, which was a music news network. But ultimately, I felt like I needed to do something that was taking advantage of the ability to stream television online. I mean, it felt to me like that old school TV with antennas and transmitter towers and broadcast trucks was so outdated. And so I started playing around with that whole notion of how do you create streaming television and streaming news service, and I created variations on that. And then Trump came along, and I thought, well, that's just an incredible thing to start looking at, because why is this man becoming president of the United States? Like, what is it that made this man viable as a leader? And I knew something was just wrong about it. It's just in my gut, and after so many years as a journalist, I just knew there was something fundamentally wrong with the scenario that was being presented to us. So I started narrative, and I did a long form real-time telling in not on video, first as a written chapters, like I do The Greatest Heist, of what was going on in 2016. And so my work in 2016 is like The Greatest Heist, but it's about Trump Russia. And it unpacks that period in real time. And I still think it's really interesting work. And at the time, I realized that interplay between real-time telling of a story versus news reporting, which is such a different thing. But telling the story in real time allows you to really impact the narrative of that story in real time as well. So that became really attractive to me as a sort of a rebellious move against traditional television, is that we could do things in the real time without any of the constraints of editors or corporate ownership or anything like that, that we were able to cut through in a way that could impact the events as they were happening. That becomes very interesting and very powerful as a means to nudge the story in directions that I wouldn't say I'm completely independent. I would say that I have I have a leaning towards democracy. I have a leaning towards human rights, and I have a leaning towards truth and freedom for people. I think those are important things to be cognizant of when you're a journalist. And you can be other things, but then you're not really being a true journalist.
Well, and I appreciate everything you just said, and I'm so glad to know that sort of background because first and foremost, I mean, starting with the first point or the last piece that you said, and then I want to work backwards. But you said mainstream censorship. That's music to my ears because I had to go on a journey that lasted far longer than I ever anticipated. Because once I started pulling threads, I started discovering what I haven't understood for many years. And I thought I was plugged in. I've been plugged in my whole life. I mean, going back to your beginning, and I love the origin story of starting in South Africa during apartheid at the only independent station. I mean, that's extraordinary because I'll tell you, apartheid was a huge influence in my life back in the 80s that would lead to all sorts of things that our knowledge in the States of Nelson Mandela that would lead to a social movement that would pressure American corporations to stop doing business with South Africa. And it worked. And
Yeah, it was very helpful.
Well, it'd be interesting to know how helpful. Obviously, my perception was at least it led to at least a lot more awareness of all things. And of course, from that time period, those of us who lived through it. I mean, Nelson Mandela became a hero to so many, and it's such an extraordinary story once you started to uncover that. And I remember Matt Damon's portrayal as the Springboks rugby player who was one of the key sort of vectors in reaching across the
Invictus, yeah.
Yeah, Invictus, exactly, which was a brilliant story in itself after all of the horrible things that Mr. Mandela had to endure, which is almost beyond the pale. But moving forward, and I could certainly, and I will, and I want to. This is kind of an initial dialogue to help frame sort of the methodology between us, just because we have so much information. And my hope is that we can start to find that Venn diagram, which I've already started with, and then ended with, of course, because of your relationship with mainstream media. But going into your wonderful Substack page and how you approach the information that you're getting out there, we're living in an extraordinary time at the moment. I mean, the assassination of Charlie Kirk actually happened in my backyard. I live in Utah, and I've lived in Utah off and on for some time. And so I'm very familiar with the state. And I was tuned into your coverage over the past few days where you were providing video and assessment and, your process. And I was comparing it to mainstream, honestly, and other things that I was seeing online. And I thought to myself, this is actually more insightful. It's more helpful. And it led to a lot of revelations of things that I wasn't even considering. And I want to touch down upon some of those in reaction, though. But I want to start with you and how you're seeing this story unfold and what are the key ingredients.
I just came off a show where I got a little bit of heat from the people who were chatting on there because I sounded like I'm defending Charlie Kirk, and I am actually defending Charlie Kirk because not because of everything he said. He said some ghastly things. He believes in terrible things sometimes, and I'm willing to give him some flexibility on that because of the environment with which he came out of. But what I was struck by in researching him was how in recent months, I have a deep focus on the Epstein files, obviously, because of the greatest heist. So I'm really understanding that story and how difficult it has been to get Congress to the position where they might be releasing those Epstein files. And yet the person who probably got us there the most was Charlie Kirk, in that in the last few months, he has been quite vocal about his opposition to the Israeli government, its actions in Gaza, its activity related to Epstein, because he clearly worked for them or Israeli military intelligence. And as a far-right, sort of supposedly MAGA commentator, for him to be bucking the system as he was, because he was a product of Israel. The David Horowitz Foundation, largely funded out of Israel, is what created Turning Point, is what created Charlie Kirk, and there's all these
I
other
was not
associated
aware of that,
funders.
by the way.
Yeah.
Thank you for that
Okay.
because I was actually curious. I did they have any connectivity to anything Coke by way of Heritage Foundation or anything else?
They do, but I can't remember this is I have to go back to my deep research. I haven't done the studies. I haven't looked into my research on David Horowitz for a while, but he the coalition that made up MAGA in 2016, involved the Sheldon Adelson and his money that mostly some people say came out of China, but his fortune from the Sands Casino Group. There was John Paulson, as we've discussed before, and there was others. But David Horowitz was a sort of a sideline that the Israelis were developing into sort of to build a viable information ecosystem in America that was going to be pro-Israel. So, these people, Stephen Miller, David Horowitz, Stephen Miller, Charlie Kirk, and Candace Owens came out of that environment. They were sort of hand-selected and groomed into that world. And so for the last, few months, to see Charlie Kirk take such an oppositional stance to the people who created him, and then, as according to Candace Owens, him losing all his supporters, all his big-time donors that were part of that same Adelson Horowitz universe, is really fascinating to me, and it's something that's been completely ignored by the media. They are fully focused on who the killer is, which could be any, is about as much of a construction as you can imagine. We just don't know anything about who really killed him, and the stuff that we're learning about this guy makes it more suspect every day that he is the guy. But what we can say quite fundamentally, and no one is reporting, is that Kirk had a real disagreement with the Israeli leadership, with Bibi Netanyahu in particular, about what they were doing in Gaza and about what their role was with the Epstein files.
Well, I feel like I wish I had a nuclear emoji coming out of the top of my head, but I read that, so I was somewhat prepared to know that was your your sort of framing. However, and I'm not going to push back on any of it, I find it incredibly fascinating, particularly from an intelligence standpoint, because a lot of your work, what it demonstrates is what I've been wondering about really for the last many decades, is what's behind the curtain, behind the curtain, behind the curtain, because the more you explore and the more you follow the money and you follow the geopolitics and the kind of the fissures and the global turning moments over the course of the last 4 decades, it all tends to kind of revolve around the same sort of apparatus. And I'm not going to get into a global Zionist cabal or anything like that. I'm going to say money primarily and capital flows and many other things. But you bring up some really intriguing sort of context, particularly, I mean, Candace Owens, I could go off on a tangent, but from where you're sitting, what sort of are the connect the dots, if you want to personify it that way, or what are the things that you're looking at in what order? What is the chronology? What is the priority for what you're seeing on develop? Because I'll ask this last question. It's a little bit of a compounded question, but outside looking in, meaning that I live in this state and I know who Governor Cox is, and I know what Governor Cox's recent background and affiliation is. There's some real questions that I have regarding much of his statements over the course of the last 48 hours.
I'd be interested to hear about that because, I find his questions, he seems to be leading into a direction which the FBI are not willing to even step into yet. And he seems to be, he's doing everything in his power to feed into this narrative that it's not someone from his state, that it's sort of another person. It's not a white Mormon from Utah. It's everything else. And that to me is exactly what intelligence agencies do, and what the Israelis are particularly proficient in doing, in setting narratives and in managing the media to the extent that they can control what is reported. And having been on the inside of these major networks, I can tell you that's very true. Just the reality of it is, even though the supposed independence, you don't really have independence. There's an enormous influence networks inside those networks that determine what gets put out on the air, how it gets put out on the air. There are sponsors, there are executives, all of whom are designed to make sure that you don't step out of line in terms of production of news or anything like that, or what you report. So, for a long time, we just haven't been told the truth. And when I look at sort of the narrative that I see constructed by Cox and by others in this story of Charlie Kirk, none of it is striking me as being genuine, or anything that's feels like a really an authentic narrative here.
Well, I'm curious if you could, maybe further expand your, I think, provocative reaction to the fact that you felt like Cox was leaning. Can you explain that further?
Well, I noticed that he's leaned into this notion of the roommate, which might be transsexual. Like, I mean, that's something we have very little visibility into. It's such an unusual thing to confirm when, so he's got a roommate that's trans. Okay. This makes him a part of what? A terrorist trans group, a terrorist cell. I mean, it's so, it's so pathetic and like unbelievable that you can make that leap. That his roommate is trans and therefore he's part of a trans terror cell is bizarre, but also it feeds directly into what they're trying to do, which is to vilify trans people, to make them out to be killers when they're not, to make them out to be a threat to society when they're not, and it's almost like you're living in a science fiction novel. It's so bizarre that trans people of all people are going to be the most violent people in your society that are picking up guns. Well, no, newsflash, the most violent people are white, white Christian men. That's who seems to be conducting most of the violence in our society these days.
Well, I think your instinct is spot on, and I'm going to further the idea based on some of my perspective, having lived in the state and what that means. And there are some corollaries, interestingly enough, at least to the idea of South Africa, because white is definitely a predominant race in the state of Utah. This is about the whitest state in the United States,
Yeah.
and there are things that are associated with that. But whoa, did you go off camera or did we just get?
Oh, maybe I did. Maybe it's just sorry, I use a strange camera. Sometimes it knocks me off.
Okay,
Why
I'm
did it
just
do
making
that? Let me
sure
see if
that
I can
we're
get it
not being
back.
infiltrated.
Oh, I
Um,
doubt it. You can't see me yet though, right? So let
no,
me figure out why. Okay.
yeah. Why? Okay, there
There.
you go. Yeah, you're good. So that was my instinct. There's so many things flooded me initially because I have a 20-year-old son in the state of Utah who's lived through COVID, and he became a bit of a like what is being described by many out there as a real scenario, a real problem that we have in the United States, that young men without a lot of direction have found themselves online over the course of now decades. And a lot of these people might find their way through 4chan or hate groups online, dark web type stuff. And just the opposite of what the notion of trans would be, obviously, in terms of a pin it on them, because that fits in with what, of course, Trump and the rest of MAGA in this moment would be, and that's what we've heard from Trump the entire time, from the reactions of all this. But furthering the notion, it's just such a strange paradox because you have what appears to be Tyler, and boy, his last name's eluding me.
Tyler Robinson. Robinson, is that
Robinson,
right?
sorry. Yeah, Tyler Robinson, that is correct. Conservative family, Mormon family. I think his father had some sort of affiliation, although I think it might have been misreported that he was a sheriff. But obviously, very pro-gun, very conservative, and yet the kid's very intelligent, but yet somewhat, and it's probably because of the age time period, because of what happened with COVID and everything else. So many people got alienated. They had to go online for their studies. They were, and that's how these things got weird with these incel. And, it's just, there's a specific sort of construct that, and I'll even take it a step further. And I'm going to play real science fiction here for a second. So, as a father of this now 20-year-old and who's seen this in real time throughout my son's entire life, and I was, complicit in this. I would buy video games starting with Call of Duty, and Call of Duty had many variations. by the time you get into like the third or fourth chapter of the Call of Duty, warfare, the images, the perception were that you would have special ops guys that were shrouded in masks, very similar to what we're seeing with ICE. But
Yeah,
of
it's pretty
course,
interesting.
during right, and you kind of
Mm.
think to yourself, okay, who is Peter Thiel? Who are these guys? How far out in advance do these guys think? And I mean, and you've been living inside the matrix for so long because I interact with New York Times op-ed, excuse me, New York Times journalists. As a matter of fact, a guy I have a terrific relationship is a gentleman by the name of David Enrich. David Enrich was the lead business editor that just finally revealed all things Chase in context to, of course, Epstein. How many years later? Okay, fine. But I've worked with William D. Cohen. I've worked with many others I don't want to name drop. Bottom line for me personally, my upbringing, I came up and like you, I've got parallel interest in journalism. In the United States, a huge influence on me was gonzo journalism. Now, granted, I grew up in the 70s and rock and roll and a little bit of satire where it comes in the National Lampoon angle. But when I say gonzo, it was really truly about you put yourself in the story, but to get to the truth and the perspective because of all of the madnesses that's taking place. And to your point about this feels like science fiction, given everything that we're talking about, there's a question in here somewhere, but the perspective is that, oh my God, when you were speculating and others that maybe this could be maybe a special ops operation because it fits. Maybe they were trying to silence Kirk because of things Epstein, and these all make sense to me, right? But so too, when I saw Tyler on the roof running, I was like, that guy looks like my son. He looks like every other 20-year-old in the state of Utah. And he obviously was handy
Did
with
you
a
know?
gun.
How could you see him? Did you? I couldn't tell him clearly enough from that picture of him
His
running along the
height,
roof. That
his height and his demeanor and how he
yeah.
operated looks like 100 kids that I know. That was
Okay.
just I'm just telling you my first
Yeah, yeah.
taste.
I mean, I don't think we know that it's is Tyler yet. I mean, I think
No, I'm
it's an
sure.
assumption that he.
I'm
Yeah.
sure. But what I saw though, and see, this gets into, and this is the parable that I'm talking about with your science fiction metaphor, right? Or Orwellian, or Huxley, or any of those, scenarios that we've grown up with and been stupefied by, but we're seeing in real time. It's a really confounding scenario, and then you add on how fast information is spread, and you're
Mm.
trying to keep up with it. How do you compartmentalize it? How do you unpack it? How do you stay on top of it?
I mean, I'm a news journalist, so for me, I like breaking news, and I like digging into the first few minutes of breaking news a lot because it's still then that nothing is really settled yet. It's amazing how quickly sort of social media and other media sort of lands on a narrative and then they run with it. But in the first little minutes of breaking news process or any news story, it's up for grabs, which I think is something that the manufacturers of narratives are very aware of now, and they sort of try to dive in and insert their version of the truth really quickly. But I guess I'm very familiar now that I don't believe the first thing that's said. Having grown up in South Africa under apartheid government and broadcast in that world, I've never been a believer that the first thing you hear is the truth. What you're hearing is someone trying to spin the truth in many different directions, maybe even competing forces trying to spin the truth, and so trying to navigate what the truth is through that is what I try to do. And I call it, I say truth lives here because I take a sort of a slightly different approach than other people. I'm very fact based. Like if something should have to be proven in fact, it's got to be there factually, and it's got to be probably double sourced before I'd even run with it. But more than that, I look at the probability of an event happening. So, and sometimes I do this algorithmically, and I run it through AI, or sometimes I just do it on my own. But if it's, I figure out whether the actual event is likely to have taken place considering everything contextually around it. So it's the thing that I think intelligence agencies use. I don't know enough about intelligence work to know exactly how this works, but that, rather than tell you that one thing is a fact or completely 100% proven, they'll give you a high confidence that something is proven, or a low confidence, or whatever it is. And oftentimes, as someone once told me, if you've got like the Bugs Bunny cartoons where the guy runs through the rocks and leaves an outline. You can often see the outline. You could, if you were told to figure out if the rabbit was there. I think it's the rabbit. I don't remember who it is that runs through. Either see you see the outline, you can pretty much assume that animal, that rabbit, whatever it is. Who is it that runs through it? I don't remember.
Probably Wile E. Coyote, I'm
Yeah,
thinking.
Kylie Coyote. Yes, exactly. Wile E. Coyote runs through it. Now you can see that the coyotes run through it, and you can pretty much assume that that's from his outline. That's him. And there's a way to do that with every news fact and every news scenario. If you build context around it, if you understand if you build timelines, and if you build build a real understanding of who your characters are, you can figure out what their moves are. You can figure out that they're likely to run through rocks and whatever, and therefore if they're likely to do it, they might have likely done it in the situation that was necessary for you to prove. So my point is, there's traditional news reporting that's very much part of my lifeblood, but then also look at the probability, and then you have to look contextually at what's going on timeline wise, and figure out whether these characters are predisposed to doing things like that.
Wow. I find that so cool because I'm going to offer some mixed metaphors here in response to that. First, I'm reminded of the Matrix. You begin to see patterns, and then you see things in slow motion, and then you're like, okay, then you can like hyper focus on, where the energy has to be, so to speak, and your mind has to operate with lightning speed and dexterity to be able to do that. And I think that is personified in your writing. I wasn't able to finish my thought earlier because I got lost in my own words. But when I read your stuff, having some knowledge of a lot of what you touched down upon, because I've had to come at it from a different angle, but you fill in blanks of things that when I was comparing the fact that I know some of the best journalists in the business, I know people that are at the highest levels of journalism that I actually respect and I'd still rely on and that sort of thing. And it goes on from there. But what I've read from you and what I discovered from you in a very short period of time, and I hope we can get into in further dialogue, is so extraordinary and so in depth and so the breadth, but yet it's the intuition and the way you develop the storyline that is so easy to follow. And in the nature of this complication, when everything is coming at you, one of the analogies that I was thinking of that you were going to express as it related to Bugs Bunny is another moment that always stuck in my brain from that era was Bugs Bunny would confuse people by pointing in every different direction at once.
Right.
And nobody had any idea what the hell he was doing. And so then he could get away with whatever the moment was calling for, right?
Yeah.
So as we go, yeah, right, exactly. But as we go back into the sort of the moment here, though, the critical situation for me, and I think that we're both on the same page here, is that really my North Star has always been anti-fascism. Everything that I am is anti-authoritarian, really, and I all about truth and dignity and integrity. That's the only way democracy and liberty can flourish, right? And that's what I believe about dynamism and people living their best existence and that sort of thing, just on a philosophical bent. But none of it happens without A, the integrity or the character within the institutions to make it so, and B, those in the media that reflect the story, because that's the whole purpose of the fourth estate, is to provide insight, but more importantly, facts and narrative to be able to provide the reflection of the story in so much that we can understand it. Because otherwise, everybody gets completely overwhelmed. Too much information, too much misinformation. And as you discuss intelligence, and I'll use one last analogy here before I ask you to respond to it. But in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, for example, in the United States, and I don't know if you remember that day, but immediately everyone on mainstream media was acting as if it was an accident. And the way it seemed to come through with those that were reporting the news in real time as it was happening, my feeling was they thought it was a natural disaster of some sort. That's the way it felt, right? Now, meanwhile, my phone's ringing off the hook. I get a phone call from Jerry Bruckheimer's office. Jerry Bruckheimer is one of the most well-known executive producers in Hollywood. He's done some of the biggest movies from Top Gun to, recently with Brad Pitt in F1. That's the level of this guy. He's about as big as they get. By the way, interestingly enough, in a quick sidebar, but his partner was a guy by the name of Don Simpson, Don Simpson was really on the level of a Jeffrey Epstein and all of those bad actors of
Mm.
that time period. So there were two different sides of that coin. But the reason I was talking to his office is because I had written a script long before that, that basically was picking up on all things bin Laden at that time that we saw on CNN. And of course, him basically waging jihad. And I was trying to make people aware that the lights were blinking red,
Mhm.
that there was an inevitability of a massive, massive terrorist attack that would lead to incredible carnage, right? And here I was in real time watching the reaction from mainstream act as if it was something completely disconnected to what reality would later reveal, right? And
And
so,
we still don't really know, we still don't really know what 9/11 was. I mean, certainly we know bin Laden's involvement. That's to some extent seems to have been, I mean, that was true, but also potentially a narrative as well. And we just don't know who the powers are um, that really created 9/11. I'm talking about the forces behind bin Laden, not necessarily these are, anything we
sure.
don't,
Well, we
there's
know
always
bin Laden
layers
was
of,
CIA,
yeah,
Afghanistan, and many, many, many other things we could discuss.
yeah,
But
yeah.
that wasn't the point of my intent. It was just more of like the in the moment sort of reaction to like things, but based on knowledge, right? I mean, you have to understand patterns. Go ahead.
Well, as journalists, we tend to lean into the most, likely recent example that we have to say this is the scenario that is happening. So, if you've recently covered a plane crash that was from natural causes, you're leaning towards that as being sort of the most, if you see something like that happening. But that moment was so unusual. That moment was so jarring for everybody. We'd never seen anything like that. Um, and it's a little bit like Charlie Kirk. It's not that we haven't seen assassinations before. We haven't really seen an assassination in in America for a while. Like a big. Oh, I don't know. I was French there. Sorry, I don't know what happened there. I don't know why it keeps doing that. But there you go. Sorry about that. Give
No
us back
problem.
here. I don't know what I was saying. I was saying something about
Charlie
we hadn't
Kirk was
seen.
something that was not necessarily extraordinary, but certainly under the circumstances, the big picture, obviously something that's absolutely critical.
Yeah, and so when we haven't seen something for a while, we are not used to reporting on it. It's hard for us to find the reference points for it. And you know, I just now, after many years in this business, realize that everything is a construction. Like we very rarely get to the truth of something. It's certainly not at the beginning, of a narrative cycle. Um, and so you have to view the world with the kind of cynicism, I guess, that everything isn't always what it seems, and the thing you're being told is often a construction of what someone wants you to believe.
Absolutely. Okay, so here we go, and I know you have to jump, and I'll go as long as you're willing. But it's just been a great first dialogue, and I hope the first of many. But moving forward with what is happening in the moment, what do you think is important, and what do you think we should be considering as the story is unfolding?
I think it's almost really hard to even talk about these things because you're immediately a target when you say these things. And I'm a Jewish man I was born in Israel. I love Israel, and I have family in Israel, and I don't have any uh, ill will to Jewish people at all. You know, I am Jewish, so it's really hard for me to imagine the world where I would be like that. Um, and yet, I am really struck by the current Israeli government um, meddling in other countries' domestic affairs in a way that has reached a level of um, almost complete control in some ways of this trumpet regime. Um, you know, it, it's it's quite it's quite daunting to think that that is where we are, even because those are the tropes that people accuse us of, and here we are doing the things that people accuse us of. Um, but it seems bizarre to say the least that Bibi Netanyahu would be the first person to come out after Charlie Kirk's assassination and be the first person um, to say prayers and the first person to eulogize and to try place Charlie Kirk in the narrative, appearing on Fox News and then Newsmax, and then, you know, an active participant in the immediate reaction story to a domestic terror event. It seems bizarre to me that that's what was going on. And yet there it was on our TV screens and online. And to me, it's a telling thing that, you know, this guy who runs another country is so aware and so adept at playing the American media scene that he is willing to insert himself into such a controversial story right at the very beginning. That to me is suspicious. You know, it's suspect as or sus, as the kids might say. But it's just, you know, to me we've got a real challenge there, and it's not one that we're going to be able to you know, defeat without acknowledging some of the things that have happened in our recent past. But, you know, it strikes me that I don't know if Donald Trump would have been the president of the United States without Israel's support in 2016. And it's also likely that, you know, as we look at what Charlie Kirk's foundation was and how it was funded out of Israel and David Horowitz, well, why is Israel funding a youth movement that's so conservative in America? Like, what is going on there that would need them to do that? You know, similarly, I think back the years before that, Netanyahu was one of the founders of Breitbart. You know, why is the Prime Minister of Israel launching Breitbart? Why is he creating this right-wing megaphone in America? Why were his intelligence, private intelligence groups that came out of their military intelligence unit, the 8200 in Israel, why were they involved with the Trump campaign? Why were the Psy Group, Psy Group, involved with the Trump campaign for almost a year in 2016? These things make no sense to me. You know, that another leader of another country like that would have such a interest in being involved directly in a superpowers, you know, government, and yet it seems to be widely accepted that that's the way it is.
Well, that was a mind-blowing, extraordinary sort of synopsis, and I'm so glad you were transparent about that because I too am Jewish, and I was raised as a Reform Jew in the United States. And if you understood our culture at that time period, we're pretty much pro-Israel, all pro-Israel, but very much in a reformed way, right? Definitely not Orthodox, definitely not zealot in any way, shape, or form. All professionals, the type of people that make their way into being doctors, attorneys, accountants, that sort of thing, right? It was very, you know, uh, let's just say upwardly mobile, dynamic, the ultimately epitomizing the American dream, so to speak. And I was only born 23 years after the Holocaust, and so the Holocaust has always been my North Star by way of anti-fascism. And to these points that you brought up are very difficult for me personally, because I too find myself asking questions that don't make any sense to me. And I have a pretty decent knowledge and understanding of the history of Israel, of 1,000 years of history of persecution and everything that made up everything from the pogroms to anti-Semitism and all of the different stages of it. But when you get into post, obviously, the calamity of World War II and all of the things that were taking shape and these questions that you ask, it was hard for me, and I'll just jump ahead because I could go on and on. I think that we'll save that for another day if we might. But for me personally, as an American Jew, and by the way, my last name Lovell, my father wasn't Jewish. My father's English. My mother is Jewish from Ukraine. And by the way, I found out, and just as a sidebar, Lovell means the wolf,
Yeah,
as
you
does
mentioned
you,
that. That's
as does your name Zev,
yeah,
from what I understand in Hebrew, which I
yeah.
think is a pretty fun connection. That was my nickname. Whatever, not important, but kind of funny. But on October 7th, when I watched that, horrific day and that fateful day, the first thing that chimed off in my head, because I, know about all of the things that took place with, um, you know, um, I'm trying to think of the prime minister, not Perez, but anyway, whatever, in terms of giving back Gaza, but the wall and all of the other elements that took place. And the first thing that I saw, of course, in the coverage outside of the all night rave that was happening, where this tragedy took place. But I was looking initially at the paragliders flying over the wall, which is one of the
Yeah.
most heavily defended places on earth. And not too much
Bizarre.
long, and we saw how many, months later, not even months, but it was, of course, the Iron Dome, and I think there was like 1,200 missiles repelled, right? So it's kind of like, okay, you took out 1,200 missiles, but you didn't get the paragliders. That was the first big red flag. And to your point about 9/11, there's other things, but
I mean, it's a very
maybe
good point.
maybe if you could just kind of take us out of here, because obviously let's leave it like a like a what's the word I'm looking for, like a cliffhanger, right? Because hopefully people will
Yeah.
start turning more into these dialogues, because there's so much I know that eventually I want people to discover through you.
Well, I
But
think
it
the, sorry, go ahead.
No, but I'm just talking about your personal work, and
No.
I would please everybody check out the narrative
Right.
on on Substack especially, and other things that are relevant. But if you could just kind of maybe close us out here, in this dialogue, because for me, what I am most concerned about at the moment, right, is that we're seeing the end of democracy in the United States. We've already
Mhm.
seen ICE, we've already seen Doge, we've already seen the Supreme Court, we've already seen everything that those of us who understand the Constitution throw the baby out with the bathwater. We live in a police state. We have a paramilitary arm called ICE, and I could go on and on and on. But now
Yeah.
they have this situation
You know
where
what?
they've
Sorry to
been.
interrupt you. I gotta just blow my nose. Give me a second. I'm sorry.
Sure, sure.
Sniffing too much. Sorry, here I am again.
I just pushed
Hi.
pause. Go ahead.
Okay. Hi, I'm back.
So to tee up the question again, though, I mean, it's just like the thing that I'm most concerned about is that, okay, we know that Ernst Roth was assassinated in Germany, that would ultimately lead to Kristallnacht. Are you concerned about, what appears to be a, I don't know, what I've been thinking about since Israel and October 7th and everything else, how everything became this militarized scenario. Could something like that happen in the United States, or is that a
Yeah, it's
stretch?
incredibly concerning. My parallel thinking about this weekend was about Vladimir Lenin, whose death was, you know, huge thing in Russia. Obviously, he died from a stroke in '53, but had previously been the target of an assassination attempt that had, uh, you know, created these health issues that led to his death a few years later. But what struck me about, the Charlie Kirk sort of Lenin uh, parallel is that Lenin was, martyred in a way that a few people have ever been martyred. I mean, he's already still lying in state in Red Square. His body's still there. He's still used as an icon for the great movement that was, their great movement, or so-called movement, the revolution in that led to the communist regime in the USSR. And yet, the thing that actually he was used to make to sort of defracture, to unite the entire communist movement behind Stalin, who was even more fundamentally right, well, out of his right wing or left wing, but is more authoritarian and more and less progressive in many ways than Lenin. And so I think what we're seeing with Charlie Kirk is exactly that kind of thing. That Charlie Kirk was fairly uh, opposed to the Trump regime's handling of the Epstein files, was beginning to be very outspoken about Israel and particularly about October 7th, as you just mentioned, was really quite provocative in his criticism of October 7th. And I maybe became a disposable figure for this group. And disposable in some ways, but also useful in his death in ways that he would not be in life, in that he would be easy to be martyred and easy to then move the entire MAGA movement into a more radicalized, um, united, but far more right-wing version of what they are today. And that's what worries me is I think we're seeing the kind of, Lenin, by all accounts, was a lot more nuanced and progressive a thinker than Stalin. And even though Lenin's death was memorialized and he lies in state, it's really Stalin who whose actions would come to determine the future of the Soviet Union. And we could be facing the same kind of fate in America, which would be devastating, obviously. And that's why I think the truth in this particular case is so important that we get out, that it's not one of those things that we can can try and avoid because we don't want to offend Israel, we don't want to offend people. We have to make sure that as many people are aware that this is a narrative that's being constructed, and we need to be as transparent about what we know about it as possible.
Well, I think that was well said. And I also love the fact that you got a little bit befuddled talking about Lenin through Stalin, because I've always told people Stalin was as far as communism as you could get ideologically. He was a strongman.
Mm.
And
Yeah,
tens of
yeah,
millions of people
murderer.
died as a result of that. And it's just about power. And I always say that the ism sometimes doesn't matter. It's the actions of the actual system itself. And we could cross pollinate and we could create the hybrids and the Venn diagram and everything else about how ridiculous Trump is in the context of all of this. But we both know that this story didn't just begin. It's been like everything in history, it's a continuum. It doesn't happen in a
Hmm.
vacuum. It's moving forward. And I'll give you, if you have any closing comments, but I will recommend that everybody, please check out Zev Shalev on Substack again at the narrative. And in fact, I'm going to look back at the page again. It's the narrative with Zev Shalev, where truth lives. And is there any other platforms that we should discuss?
Well, it's a weird spelling of narrative, so I'll just say it's a narrative, NARATIV.org, which is an unusual thing for a website. So it's a narrative.org, but it's a misspelling, NARATIV.org, which is where you can find all my work.
Outstanding. Well, it was so great to connect with you. I hope we can engage in more. And I am just so pleased to have discovered your work. It's mind boggling. And I encourage everybody to check it out. Thank you so much, Zev. All the best
Thank
to
you,
you. And I look
Patrick.
forward to our next conversation. Take care.
Me too. Thank you very much. Really appreciate your time and your insight. Thank you.
Absolutely.